Have you ever been to a restaurant and the waitresses enjoy your meal and you accidentally say you too? That's the level of awkwardness we're talking about when we discuss Kirby games on the Nintendo DS. I want to talk about the Kirby situation on the Nintendo DS. Kirby stayed busy on this handheld. As you can see, 4 major Kirby releases on the Nintendo DS, all of them being various styles of games, different levels of quality, and I just kind of want to go through and look back at what was happening around that time. First, we have to give a little history about what came out before these games on the DS. I think we should kind of set the scene though before we get to Kirby on the DS. Looking back, right before the DS was the Game Boy Advance, and Kirby had a decent showing on the Game Boy Advance. He had a remake of Kirby's Adventure from the NES called Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland. That was a stellar remake, beautiful art style, fixed some of the issues that old NES game had, and overall it's just a really stellar remake. Then they also had Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, which is a totally different style Kirby game on the GBA. That game almost follows a sort of Metroidvania style gameplay, being this kind of open world, interconnected landscape. It was a very unique take on what makes a Kirby game a Kirby game. And I think that game did a really good job making something unique in the Kirby franchise. You know, the Game Boy Advance was a pretty standard handheld. There was no cheap gimmicks. There was nothing flashy. It was all about making a good Game Boy console. Going on to the DS, things kind of shift a little bit. They kind of start embracing some more gimmicks, things such as the touchscreen, the microphone. And around this time, Nintendo started branching out to kind of these untapped markets. You know, they titled it their Blue Ocean strategy, going for more of the casual market. So games like Nintendogs, for example, was a big hit amongst the casual fans. But a lot of Nintendo's first party titles started using some of those gimmicks of the Nintendo DS. Think Metroid Prime Hunters, for example, used a touchscreen. Super Mario 64 DS had an option to use the touchscreen to control the camera movements. Nintendo was embracing the DS for what it was and what they wanted it to be. And we also see that with Nintendo's first Kirby game on the DS, Kirby Canvas Curse. Now, this game came out in the launch year of the DS, in 2005, and this game takes full advantage of what makes the Nintendo DS unique. This is a completely touchscreen dependent game. You do not use the D-pad at all to control this game. And something a little quirky about it, they made Kirby a ball. Hal took the axe to Kirby's arms and legs, and now he's just a little circle. And like I said, you control this game with the touchscreen entirely. And you don't even really control Kirby in this game. You are more guiding Kirby to the end of each level. You use the stylus to kind of draw these rainbow paths that Kirby kind of rides like a rail. You can tap on Kirby to make him dash. If you dash into an enemy that can give you a power-up, you get copy abilities. This game has a very unique control scheme, especially for a Kirby game. This is not a traditional Kirby 2D platformer by any stretch of the imagination. Since this game came out in that first year of the Nintendo DS's launch, it makes sense why it kind of veers more towards that casual kind of gameplay. Once you boot up the game, it has a pretty extensive tutorial because even though the controls become more intuitive as you play, at first they definitely take some getting used to. You know, the whole plot is this witch Dracia transforms Kirby into a ball, and you have to get to the end of each level and fight a boss. You get a choice of which boss you fight each time, which is kind of a fun little spin on things. And as you progress, the bosses level up as well. So each time you face the boss, it should be a little bit more difficult. Keeping in line with other Kirby games, each of the levels spell out a certain word when you put them all together. And so in this case, if you take the first letter out of each of the levels, it spells out rainbow. Visually, the game is very nice to look at. It takes this more abstract approach to the visuals. Definitely feels like an artist made this game. I understand what Hal is going for making this the first Kirby game on the DS. It definitely takes advantage of what makes the DS the DS. And it's a unique sort of spin on what makes a Kirby game a Kirby game. This is definitely not like any other 2D platformer in the Kirby franchise. It's probably more considered a spin-off than anything. I think for what Kirby Canvas Curse was trying to accomplish, I think it does a decent job doing so. I mean, this game feels like it came out in the DS's launch year. In terms of modes in the game, you know, you have your main game, you go through 8 different levels total, each one broken up into about 3 smaller levels. Then you have the Rainbow Run mode, which just has different options for different trials. You can take one option's a time trial, just try to finish the level as fast as you can. The other one, you're trying to use the least amount of paint from your paintbrush that you can. I mean, pretty simple, nothing too special. Then you have the sub-games. The sub-games are just based on the boss fights. So one of your boss fights, you fight against DDD. I say fight, you're racing him in a cart like it's Donkey Kong. And so the sub-games there, you know, they're they're safe, they're fine, they're nothing special. This is not a game I would go back to a whole lot compared to some of the other games on the DS, but I definitely see the vision that they had for this game, and I think overall, the game turned out pretty well. So much so that it would get a sequel on the Wii U, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse, which, again, has a beautiful art style, but follows the same sort of gameplay format as Canvas Curse, which I think shows that with Canvas Curse, they kind of nailed this gameplay style on the first try. But yeah, for a first Kirby game, it's neat. It's definitely not going to give a Kirby fan what they're looking for exactly. That is until we got Kirby Squeak Squad a year later, and oh man, this game is kind of rough. It's one of Kirby's lower points in the franchise, especially in the mainline games. Squeak Squad, Squeak Squad kind of hurts. I think the designs in this game are awesome. I think the general concept of the game is really good. Kind of following this sort of treasure hunting sort of Kirby game. I think it's an interesting hook to get us in. I think the game looks really nice, clearly based on what the GBA was doing with Kirby style-wise. I think overall it looks really good. But this game just has some troubling things. It feels extremely rushed, first of all. This game was not developed solely by HAL. This was a joint venture between HAL and a studio called Flagship. Flagship, I believe, helped with Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, which turned out to be an amazing game. So it's kind of weird to see how that didn't carry over to Squeak Squad. The levels just kind of feel inconsistent. Some of them are really short, like they just decided to kind of cut off the level and not really finish it. Some of the levels just aren't that interesting. And a lot of the levels end in a similar way, where these treasure-stealing mice, which again, super cool idea, and you have to chase them into this little hut to get a treasure from them. It gets kind of old. In terms of the copy abilities, there's some new ones. There's this heavy rock one that makes you extremely heavy, it makes you move extremely slow. It doesn't really feel like there's much of a difference from having that compared to a regular rock ability, just that you move slower now. So it's kind of and you can find these scrolls that give you new skills for your copy abilities, which is a cool concept as well. Kind of reminds me of Kirby and the Forgotten Land, how you upgrade your copy abilities. And I think you can see the vision they had with the treasure system. Pretty much having just different unlockables based on the treasures you collect in the level. Things like alternate colors for Kirby, different puzzles you can complete, these ability scrolls that help you upgrade your copy abilities. Really neat ideas overall, and I get the vision they had. But certain things that are holding this package together just feel very sloppy. For example, the menu of your collection room is so haphazard. There's no labels for anything. It's just a bunch of different bubbles that show you what's going on. And it's just kind of hard to navigate at times. Speaking of bubbles, I didn't even mention how now you have a reserve system on the bottom screen of the DS for Squeak Squad. It's an interesting idea having a sort of inventory, but the limited space gets kind of old when you're constantly having things you have to put in there. For example, all the treasures you find take up some of that inventory space, and so it gets crammed really easily. It's neat that you can hold different power-ups in reserve there. I think being able to access certain powers whenever you want is a cool idea. I don't think it does it the best, though, again. It sort of feels like some of the need to use those DS gimmicks again, rather than kind of thinking what might be best for the game overall. The sub-games are a mixed bag. I mean, the Tea Time one is meh. The Smash Ride is not bad, but yeah, Squeak Squad, it's not a terrible game. I think it does a lot of things right, but it just feels like the game needed some more time to iron some of the issues out. And again, it's a disappointment because I think the overall concept of a treasure hunting Kirby game, I think it's already been shown that it can happen with things like the Great Cave Offensive and Superstar. And so having it kind of fall a little flat on this one kind of doesn't feel great. Oh man, but speaking of Superstar, Kirby Superstar Ultra is one of the best Kirby releases to ever grace not only the Nintendo DS, but any Nintendo console. This came out in 2008 and is a complete top-to-bottom remake of Kirby Superstar from the SNES. Originally it wasn't planned to be a crazy remake like it is. It's supposed to be more of a kind of touch-up and let it go. But they were dedicated to making this the best possible version of Kirby Superstar, and I believe they delivered. I am actually not a big fan of the original Kirby Superstar in terms of how it controls. I think the overall base of the game is fantastic, but I think the way it feels, I'm just not a big fan of, and I think they really change it up with how it feels in Superstar Ultra to where it is just perfect. I think Superstar Ultra is peak Kirby, especially 2D Kirby, in terms of how the controls operate. You have more variety with your moves with each of the copy abilities in the game, unlike something like Nightmare and Dreamland, where it's only one type of move. We're back to being developed solely by HAL, and you can tell that HAL just loves the original Superstar so much with Superstar Ultra. And yeah, I mean, there's just so much they did right about this. Like I said, visually, they enhanced the graphics so much. They use what worked about Squeak Squad in terms of the visual style, and honestly, it looks even better than that game. They retain some of the charm from the original game, and they have the nice post-it board for all the different modes in Kirby Superstar. And Superstar is just a really unique idea for a game, kind of being considered more of an anthology game, having, not only want to say mini games, almost like smaller campaigns that make up the larger game. And each of those campaigns are incredible. Spring Breeze is a remake of the original Kirby's Dream Land for Game Boy, and it is so swell. It's a quick, easy little game, and it is such a fun little romp to kind of revisit. Then you have Dynablade, which Dynablade is an iconic part of the Kirby franchise at this point, that giant metallic bird. You gotta get a unique campaign within Superstar, and it's a pretty traditional Kirby game. This really nice remake, a brand new Kirby campaign, and then something totally new, the Great Cave Offensive. Like I mentioned with Kirby Squeak Squad, that treasure hunting mechanic is a neat idea, but in that game, it was executed poorly. In this game, that idea is so well realized. You go through this sort of open zone, interconnected layout, kind of similar to Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, and your goal is to collect all the treasures. There are 60 treasures in total, and you can complete the game without collecting all the treasures, but it is so fun to kind of go through and solve the little puzzles and do what you need to do to get each of these treasures. And amongst those treasures, there are some really neat references to other Nintendo franchises. One of the last treasures you can get is the Triforce. There's one that's Donkey Kong's barrel. There's a green Koopa shell. And so it's really fun seeing all these different types of treasures that you can collect, and it's really just satisfying to go for that 100% completion in that mode. Truly one of, if not the best, in my opinion, modes in Superstar Ultra. You have Gourmet Race, which is just a fun little mode where you have to balance out going fast with collecting as much food as you can. It's, you know, it's a replayable mode. It's nothing too crazy. One of the weaker ones, I'd say. But still not a bad mode. Revenge of Meta Knight's a really fun one. You're obviously fighting against Meta Knight, but you're also fighting against the clock with a lot of time challenges. And I think that's kind of a really unique way to kind of spin some more difficulty on the game. You also get to go through different areas. You get to climb on the Halberd, Meta Knight's ship. And it's really just so full of charm. You get to hear some of Meta Knight's underlings kind of chat between themselves about what's going on. Very cool there. Then Milky Way Wishes. So Milky Way Wishes is kind of the original climax of Kirby Superstar. And this is where we get to meet Marx, we get to see Galactic Nova. And the approach to gameplay there is really nice too. You're going through different planets in kind of a back and forth, almost free roam kind of setting. And throughout you're collecting these copy essences. And so these copy essences grant you the ability to access any copy ability at any time once you've unlocked it. And you do that by accessing them on the bottom screen, which is a perfect use for that second screen. So those are the main 6 games that kind of came with the original Superstar. Of course, you had the Arena and the True Arena. That returns as well. And then you had 3 sub-games from the original. But they really decided to up the ante with Superstar Ultra. They added a couple new main games. We have Revenge of the King, which is more of just a respin on Spring Breeze, so it's kind of going through that remake of Dreamland, but it's a little more difficult this time, kind of spicing up the challenge a little bit. It's a nice addition. But then we get Meta Nightmare Ultra, which is a really cool mode where you get to go through all the main games from the original Kirby Superstar, except for Gourmet Race, I think, which is, you know, the skippable one out of all of them. And you get to complete them all as Meta Knights. That includes Spring Breeze, Dynablade, the Great Cave Offensive, Milky Way Wishes. And it's just really cool getting to go through those modes now as Meta Knight, who has his own moveset. So you're not really worrying about copy abilities anymore. And since now you have new layout of attacks, I believe you get to use this kind of in-game currency to kind of build up and use these attacks on the bottom touch screen, which is really cool. And then you have this Helper to Hero mode where you get to play as some of the enemies from Kirby Superstar, which is really cool. And they add a whole bunch of new sub-games as well. Something else that's really charming about this game is they added in brand new cutscenes to the game, and you'd think it's running on the DS, they probably use more like 2D sprites. No, they made full 3D cutscenes and crunched them onto the Nintendo DS. And they have a mixed level of quality, to say the least. Some of them look kind of rough, especially some of those ones from Milky Way Wishes. They look kind of bad. The effort to do these 3D cutscenes and put them on the DS is so charming. I love it. This is one of the all-time greats in terms of Kirby 2D platformers. This is such a great game. Like I said, the original Superstar was already good, but they took that game and made it, honestly, near perfect. If you have not tried Kirby Superstar Ultra, I think you owe it to yourself to give this game a shot because it is just so good. But then that leaves us with Kirby Mass Attack as our last Kirby game on the Nintendo DS, and I think this is a better use of the touchscreen than Kirby Canvas Curse. Yeah, I think Kirby Canvas Curse was perfect for that first year of the DS, but I think Kirby Mass Attack is just a more fun game, honestly. We kind of go back to a co-developed game for a Kirby. This is made between HAL and a studio called Engines. Engines is honestly, it's just flagship again. It's comprised of ex-flagship developers, and the whole goal here is to use the touchscreen to guide Kirby throughout each level. Instead of guiding him with these different lines and having to tap him, you just have to touch whatever part of the screen you want Kirby to follow to. So it's much easier. And as you'll notice on the box art, it's not just one Kirby this time, but you can have up to 10 Kirbys, which is so adorable. Having 10 Kirbys is so fun. You're guiding all of them. It almost feels like a Pikmin game in a way, where you're guiding the Kirbys where to go. You can flick the Kirbys at different enemies and they'll kind of automatically attack, kind of like a Pikmin would as well. And throughout each level, you're collecting different things. So you're collecting fruit, and the more fruit you eat, the more Kirbys you get. Like I said, there is a limit of 10. And so after you have 10, you're collecting fruit mostly for just points. But still, it's really fun. There are different medals throughout each level. So it's a really fun game to kind of go for 100% in, because it's easy to miss a medal. And they kind of make it not the worst to replay levels. Sometimes you'll have to replay levels because each level has a certain Kirby minimum that you have to achieve before going in. Visually, they kind of changed the art style a little bit. They have these thicker outlines, and honestly, I think it looks really nice, the overall visual identity of this game. There's a whole slew of extras that you unlock by collecting the medals, like the different sub-games that you can get. Another thing that's very satisfying is there are checklists that you can complete by completing different tasks in each level. And so it's very satisfying once you have a complete task checklist completed. And overall, there's just a good amount to do here. It feels like they kind of strike the balance of having not too much, where it kind of gets sickening, but also having enough that you feel satisfied. I think there's about 40 levels or so in the main story. And again, and since the gameplay style is different, the levels are relatively simple, but they do enough to kind of keep you engaged, especially when you get to attack enemies, you know, getting to flick each of those individual Kirbys. It's just satisfying. Even though I think this game does the whole touchscreen gimmick better than Canvas Curse, I don't want to make it seem like Canvas Curse is not a good game. I think Canvas Curse is a great game, but I think you get more, at least for me, I get more enjoyment out of Mass Attack personally than Canvas Curse. I think Canvas Curse's gimmicks feel a little old sooner than Mass Attacks do. And honestly, for a Kirby spin-off, I just think it's really fun and so charming. You know, this came out in 2011, so this is the first year. This came out after the 3DS had already launched. You know, and the developers talked about, you know, they thought about putting it over to the 3DS, but it wasn't going to use any of those 3DS gimmicks anyways, like the stereoscopic 3D, and so they just kept it on the DS. And, you know, it sold over 1 million units still, you know, for a DS game. That's not bad. And so I think this game did a fine enough job kind of ending Kirby's tenure on the DS, especially since we had just gotten Superstar Ultra a couple years back, and that was a full-blown remake, a really great remake. I think ending on something a little more unique to the DS, I think, was a smart call. Looking at this lineup of games for the DS, it's a wacky bunch for sure. I think the highs being Superstar Ultra is incredibly high for the franchise, and I think even the lows being Squeak Squad, I think you can see the vision that they had, so it's just a flawed game more than a bad game. But Kirby stayed busy on the DS, and it did use the DS for what it was, and for that, you gotta give it credit. Honestly, I would go back to pretty much any of these games and have a decent time. You know, definitely not as much Squeak Squad, but overall, each of these games has a unique place in the Kirby lineup, and honestly, I wouldn't really get rid of any of them if I had the chance to. Now this game, get this game out of here.